Well, thank you for
Uh,
for sharing your story, Tug. I think there's just so much in the story that speaks to the military tradition, your training, and everything that gets you to that point. And I think Mark Wright is a good place to start when we're talking about mental skills and especially leadership. How do you think, taking yourself inside that situation, what do you think the leadership skills, the communication skills, how did it work? What were how will you remember that part of it, the way that you guys handled it? And especially, you know, Mark Wright, he was known afterwards for his amazing bravery. Like, what actually kept you guys as tight as you could be? Because I think it's safe to say it could have gone a lot worse.
Yeah, I think, you know, some of the guys, Stu Pearson, I'd never met until that day. You know, they lived on a different outpost. I'd never ever met them. There's lots of cap badge rivalry within the military, so the paras believe they're better than everybody else. Right. You know, when I was an engineer, we believed we were better, and there's a big cap badge rivalry. And as a medic, you know, people just didn't bother with us. We were the scab lifters. That's what we were. We never had a job until Iraq and Afghanistan, and you know, lots of sort of banter, black humour. Real black humour is a big thing in the military.
Yeah.
And you know, we talked about the run earlier on. That run was probably the hardest run I've ever done in my life, because them guys knew it was one of theirs. Which gave them that sort of mental energy to sort of go faster than they'd ever been. There wasn't one of mine, if that makes sense, at the time. But I still knew I'd got a patient that I needed to get to. But obviously, carrying that sort of weight and equipment and things with you, it makes it very, very hard. And no matter what cap badge you're in, no matter what rivalry you have, when it comes to an injured serviceman or woman being injured, you're all going to give all, and it's instilled into you from day one, week one in basic training. And when we got to the minefield, it was because we didn't know it was a minefield. The maps that we had showed that where the minefields were, and this area wasn't a minefield. It wasn't a minefield planted by the Taliban. It was a legacy minefield left by the Russians from when they were there in the 80s. So basically, they'd fired mines at the hills, and over the years, they'd washed down into this old riverbed. And once we got there, again, Jarhead, I can't give him enough praise or raps. You know, in my opinion, he'd saved Stu Hale's life. And for me, when I got there, it was pretty easy. I just got to go back and start again and go through my treatment plan, which is very, very simple as a medic. You've got a set of drills that you follow, and you deviate as you need to.
Yeah.
For the command and control side of it, Mark took the majority of that. So Mark was talking back to the hill that we came from. They were then speaking back to what we call the JOC, which is the Joint Operations Command back in Camp Bastion, so hundreds of miles away. So there was big pauses in if we requested a helicopter with a winch, for example, it'd go from Mark to the hill to the hill to the JOC. Just to make people aware as well, that day has become quite famous, known as the Day of Days, because it wasn't just our incident. There was a big firefight going on in Muzakala. Sangin had a massive issue, and I believe Goresh as well. So all of our assets were stretched phenomenally throughout the country. And the communication chain going up worked as well as it could. The communication chain coming down was absolutely fantastic, to the point where at one point Mark was actually talking to the pilot of the Chinook. So he was relaying it through our base. Anything I wanted or requested, you know, I'd speak to Mark, and Mark would make it happen, and you know, it worked very, very well. The military's got a way of communicating unlike any other. You know, I've worked in the corporate world for the past sort of 10 years since I left the military, and you know, people are very nice and pink and fluffy, and to get what they want in the military, it's very much direct, and the more direct you are, shows the more urgency is required. When Mark got injured, when the first mine hit Mark, he still kept command and control, and was very much adamant that if any of us wanted anything, it went through him, which was very inspirational to see. when he got hit by the second one, he'd lost quite a lot of blood at that time, and he did start to go down slightly, but still knew he'd got a role, and to show that role was he was telling jokes. You know, he was due to get married in the November of that year, and you know, he was asking, do you think my missus will recognise me when I get back, even though he got facial damage? And you know, it's a good job which arm he'd injured was injured, because he used his other one for masturbation and things like that. And it was very black and dark.
Yeah.
But it's what the guys around him needed, because he knew if he switched off from being the commander and leader he was, other people's morale had started to drop as well.
Right.
Everyone had a role to play. You know, some of the stretcher bearers, you know, for 6 hours they held a sheet above Stu Hale. And that might not sound a lot, but when you've got a guy who's now an amputee losing blood, the last thing you want him to have is heat exhaustion or heat stroke as well. So everyone picked up the mantle, and on reflection, you know, people say to me all the time, you know, oh, it must have been horrible, you know, worst day of your life. To be honest, on reflection, it's probably one of the best days of my life. And I feel massively honoured and privileged that I got to witness the heroics that the guys showed. You know, young Andy Barlow, I think he was about 18 and a couple of months old. That's all he was at the time. He sort of grew up. So I had boys who turned to men. I got men who turned into sort of heroes, and then a hero like Mark, he turned into a legend, didn't he? So, you know, very honoured and sort of privileged to be there. Now, that was from everyone who held a blanket to throw a bottle of water and provided security for us. You know, it was an amazing thing. Right through, so the command and leadership thing, it was very dark. It was very dark humour that kept us going. But there was still an element of it afterwards as well.
Yeah.
So, for example, I remember when I put Mark onto the stretcher, onto the Black Hawk, I promised him I'd see him back at Camp Bastion. And as a soldier, we fulfil our promises. We don't, you know, we never jack on the blokes. And when I found out he'd passed away, and when I got back to Bastion, I went to the morgue and I saw him in the morgue, and they have a thing called a ramp parade where the coffin gets carried onto the aeroplane that flies off and salutes. I rode with Mark in the ambulance to the ramp parade and everything. So what would be a command and control sort of element in the corporate world is what we'd class as sort of honesty and integrity in the military world. If I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. And we did. And it was right down to, you know, literally loading him onto the aeroplane for him to come back home. And I then wrote a card to his parents explaining, you know, what heroism and courage and command and control Mark had displayed that day. And yeah, it still goes on now. You know, most of the blokes are out. There's still a couple who are still serving, but you know, when we do get together and we do have reunions, you can still see the rank structure and the command and control element through that. So yeah, it's it was bizarre, but it was very good.
Yeah. I mean, it's really none of us are. You made the comparison there between the corporate world and your situation there, and I think, you know, no one will ever be, well, people will, but a lot of us won't be in a situation like that. But I think the takeaway there seems to be the same need for cutting out not the BS and having honesty. Do you find that that's sort of, you know, you work with teams in the civilian world now. Do you think that's probably one of the biggest differences in the way that teams operate on both sides of the...
Yeah. You know, I sort of touched on it earlier. Yeah, I'd never met Stu, you know, previously, but they were my boys. And for my boys, I and everyone who was with me were willing to risk our lives to better theirs. You don't really get that in the corporate world. The corporate world is very much dog eat dog. The job I currently do now, you know, I've got a number of people who work for me, and it is very much dog eat dog. It's very much, we've got unions and we've got representation, and there's, I was going to say rules and regulations, but we did have them in the military as well. But it's very much, I find in the corporate world, people are more out for themselves, where in the military and in the services, the ambulance service, fire service, police, you know, everyone's out for each other. We've all gone through the same sort of training. We've gone through the same sort of disciplines, and whether you're a paratrooper or a marine or a medic or an engineer, you all do the same basic training. So you're all soldiers first. And because I know the person to my left and the person to my right have done the same as me, I know that they've got the same beliefs and sort of core values that I have as well.
So, I mean, it seems to me still, though, that you're never going to be able to recreate that level of bond that you have in the military and the corporate world. But it's a fair old place to look for team performance if people are wanting to get there. If there's one thing we can take out of it, is actually, you know, you might not even been friends with all of the guys that day necessarily. I mean, perhaps you were, but there's a common purpose and a common agreement which kind of needs to underpin to a certain extent how a team's going to do well and what the aims are and things like that.
I think for me, the military was quite an easy step because of my dyslexia and things at school. I got quite aggressive. I was quite lost in my own head. I couldn't figure out why I couldn't keep up with the other kids in class and whatever else. So my dad took me boxing, and I loved the physical aspect of boxing. I loved the fact of hitting a pad and all that sort of thing. It was great. But when I went in the ring, I felt lost. I was on my own, and I didn't like the fact of having to stand up on my own. And I did it for a while. I enjoyed it, but it just wasn't me. And then he said, "Why don't you try rugby?" And he took me to a rugby training session, and I fell in love. And the rugby ethos, mentality, training, you know, I've played in games where, you know, I've turned up to watch a game and there've been a player short or someone's been injured and I've put a shirt on and I've run out and played, you know, and it's as soon as you put that shirt on, it doesn't matter where you're from, what colour, what creed, what religion you are, you're on that team. And that's very much like the military, and that's what made the military so easy for me to understand. My dad had served in the military, my brother was in the military, and they used to say a phrase to me before I joined, which I could never understand until years into my career, and was play the game. And I couldn't get it. So when you're being shouted at, when you're being screamed at in, you know, in your basic training and things, it's a game because they want to break you. And if you look at a rugby pitch, you know, that defensive line pointing at you, shouting and screaming at you, it's to get into your head. And that's all it was. And so rugby for me and the military for me were exactly the same. As long as you play the game, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I really like that. That's a really good phrase. And I think, you know, I think that's really like a part of what we're trying to, you know, what we're looking at here through all the mental skills and how it applies, especially to young people, is, you know, how can we stew down these lessons out of whether it's rugby, whether it's military, and just get that better performance. And I think, you know, what you're saying is it's the confidence that you can get by knowing that people around you are going to dig in or dig up, as you might say, for you. And what do you think people can do that aren't in the military? How could people, teams, you know, what would be a thing that you make if you had an intervention to make with a rugby team or a team of corporate or, you know, school group?
So I'm quite fortunate. I coach my middle son team and down at Hereford. So I've been with them on and off since they were under nines, and that sort of young age, they're terrible because they don't listen. They just want to run around and do whatever they want.
Yeah.
They're now going into the under 15s, and they're a little bit more disciplined and they're a little bit more into the game, if that makes sense. Yeah. And to an extent, I treat them like soldiers. I don't shout them. I do shout them, but I don't swear at them. You know, and I don't thrash them. But I emphasise the core structures and core beliefs, both from what the RFU are providing and both from what the military installed in me. And it is about the team. So when we're doing warm-up games, or, you know, when we're playing in matches, you know, if we've got a 2-on-1 situation, you know, and you've sucked the fullback over, if you don't pass that ball and make it easy for the team to score, I'm going to punish you, even if you've scored. You know, I've banned all the parents from buying McDonald's and giving them a £5 every time they score a try, and flipped it. That buy them McDonald's or give them a £5 if they put a big hit in. Defence is where we need to concentrate on. So trying to install that team ethic. You know, we're looking at running obviously COVID's caused massive problems here, but we're going to look at running like a 3-day boot camp for them, where I'm going to take the forwards and backs and I'm going to mix them together and I'm going to make them study each other. So, you know, Tom, Tug, you're paired together, all right? What I want you to do is, by tomorrow night, I want you to tell me where he was born, where he grew up, what his mum and dad are called, what his favourite Xbox game is. So they're going to be forced into learning about each other, and then they'll stand up and present it. By standing up and presenting it, it's going to build on their confidence, you know. And I think that's where we'll see the natural leaders and the natural captains and etc. sort of stand out from them. I think I've seen it in a film, Remember the Titans, you know, well, Coach Carter is one of them, and it was a very, very sort of powerful lesson, and I've used that within my work environment, both in the military and in the corporate world, and it seems to come on sort of leaps and bounds. So it's about the honesty, it's about the integrity, and it's about knowing that that person to my right and that person to my left is going to give as much as I'm going to give.
Yeah.
And if we can all believe that, you know, then we'll succeed. Luckily for me, Hereford wear red, you know, so our defensive line is the red brick wall. No one goes through that red brick wall. We don't open any doors. We go up to the wall. And the boys are starting to get it, and they're sort of starting to thrive on it, which is really sort of good to see. I'm the goodish cop. We've got a bad cop, and we've got a very nice cop, and we've all got sort of roles to play. And the boys know where they are. And I think if you give people foundations and you give them rules and you give them a line, then they'll learn to live by it. You know, people going about this Xbox generation and how they're terrible and all this. I think some of the youth of today are absolutely fantastic. You know, some of the boys I deal with, we've got everything from broken homes to lads who've taken drugs in the past, you know, all different sort of varieties, and they're ace, you know, because they can all bring their different experiences, and it's how you utilize them experiences to demonstrate to the others what's good and what's bad, and also to sort of build that sort of team. And that's, for me, that works in, again, the military, the rugby, and in my corporate job as well.
Right. Yeah, it's the thing that's coming into my mind is that quote that I know the Marines hold quite dear: is the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack. And I think there's this, what's really interesting in what you're saying is that the overall pack is always made of the individual wolf. And the more that the individual personality, if you will, like more you have an identity within the team, you're going to probably pull for it more, you know. So it's not just, the team's not an amorphous blob.
You're only as strong as your weakest player. You know, whether that's in the corporate world, you know, in my job, I know who I'd send into a boardroom, I know who I wouldn't. You know, in the military, I know who I'd, you know, send on a 6-hour patrol and who I'd send on a 1-hour patrol. And in the rugby world, I know who I want to give that ball to for that first hit up, or who I want, you know, stood in the middle of the park for that first defensive hit. And it's understanding the people around you. And I think, you know, people talk about leaders and managers. I'm not a big fan of the sort of ethos behind it. Anyone can be a manager. It's a promotion, you know, and just because you're a manager at McDonald's or you're a manager at Sky or Apple or whatever, you're a manager and you've got there maybe through merit, but you may have got there by circumventing the system. So the military are very bad at this, to be fair. If you're an absolute tool and you're not going anywhere within your unit, they'll promote you to move you. And so you'll have a senior ranked person who people would look at and go, oh, you're amazing, where really they're an absolute tool. They've made their way around. And that's the same in the corporate world. I've seen it happen there. Where leaders don't always have a rank, don't always have a title. They're just natural people who, not always vocal. It's people who lead by action is my biggest thing. You don't need to have the mouth. You don't need to be the one who's center of attention. It's the one who goes and does that job to the best of their ability. It might not always be the best one, but it's the best of their ability. And they want to improve and they want to try. And, you know, some of the companies I've worked with since leaving the military don't invest in their people. And I think that's the biggest error. You know, if you invest and look after and nurture and bring people on, they'll work hard for you. Where if you treat people like rubbish and without respect, they're just going to be out for themselves. And, you know, it goes back to your wolf analogy. You know, if you watch a pack of wolves when they walk, you know, the leader goes at the rear to make sure everyone in front of them is safe. And I think the same, being a leader, that's what you've got to do. Your responsibility is to make sure those around you and those under your sort of command or control are in a good place, you know, and then deal with yourself later.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's something in here about how you want to reward as well. You know, you were talking about don't give that McDonald's for the try, and because that's an outcome. Maybe rewarding effort is a better way of doing it, because that's something anyone can give. And, you know, for a coach working with young people, it's a real easy way to keep everyone honest and clear. And I also picked up on something that you might be able to sort of say about with your coaching. It seems like it's also important for coaches, leaders to also be consistent in what they want to happen. You know, so the plan, are you quite collaborative in working out sort of how you want to message and approach young people with your co-coaches, so that when it actually happens, there's consistency there? So how do you kind of get the management?
Yeah, we're very sort of structured. We have a number of meetings prior to training sessions, and you know, we'll go and have a drink with each other. You know, to stand up, you know, we've got sort of 30 kids, you know, coming up to 15-year-olds. So there is big differences. You know, we've got families who are very wealthy, we've got families who are very poor, and you know, you've got to try and make everyone happy. And we God bless, one of our kids lost his dad last year, and you've got to learn how to manage the situation and manage that individual, but without making them stand out either. So we are very good, to be fair. We've got a very strong sort of coaching. We're not the best coach in the world, but what we are is we're very keen on the children. You know, we've sort of watched them grow and flourish, and we've seen some of them excel with confidence, and we've seen some of them excel with physical fitness, and we've seen some just float along, and they're happy to float along. And as long as we can bring out the best in the kids, whether it's physically, mentally, or academically, then we do. And you know, one of the children who plays for us, you know, his son's a headmaster at one of the schools, so if they're getting in trouble at school, we get informed with that as well. So you know, we've got a very sort of close-knit management team. The club itself is very supportive of how we do it, and they're sort of taking bits of what we do and implementing it into other age groups and things. And the kids seem to embrace it as well. And it goes back to that they've got rules, and I think that's what's missing in today's society. I remember when I was a kid, you know, I grew up, if you've ever seen The Last of the Summer Wine, I grew up 2 villages across from it, you know, so we had a village police officer, and you know, got in trouble, he'd give you a clip round the ear, and by the time you got home, he'd been there and told your mum, so you got another one. Where now, I think in today's society, there's a lot of respect, you know, discipline and things that are missing. And I understand there's reasons why parents can't do it at home, but if a child's going to volunteer or a parent's going to sign a child up to go into any form of sport and any form of discipline, they've got to understand that there is a discipline package that comes with it. And if you can be honest with them from the start, and they can show you a bit of integrity, and you know, you put that line in the middle, then you're laughing. You know, we've had some bad cases with some of the children. You know, one of the coaches got assaulted and things like that, and it is hard. But I'd say 99% of the kids we've been with have definitely improved, you know, physically and mentally, which is good.
Yeah, I mean, so it seems like there's 2 really, because you know, and listening to what you're saying and having been around in rugby coaching myself, it's not this isn't a common approach, I wouldn't say, but I think what's clearly 2 elements of it that really are important are getting to know the individual and getting them to understand that you support them, but the flip side of that being the quid pro quo, like that's what you get from us, and here's what we'll get from you. And I think one thing that's really important here that you're really saying is setting those expectations early and making sure that I think young people struggle a lot of the time just to not with rules or it's with the lack of them and understanding like what they have to do to do well.
Consequence. The youth don't understand consequence, do they? You know, I've said it to my kids: if you do that again, you're going to be banned off your Xbox, or you're going to be grounded. And then they do it again. 10 minutes later, they say, "Oh, I'm sorry." And you say, "Okay, crack on." In the big bad world, in the real world, there is consequences for your actions, and that is the sort of driver we put into the sort of team that we're working with. That whether if you're not giving 100%, there's a consequence. They're going to score. You know, if you're not turning up for training on time, there's a consequence. You're going to run extra laps, because by you not giving, the team are going to suffer. And that's what you've got to understand: is it's not about you. Life's not about you as an individual. Life is what you can do for others, and you know, that's the sort of big thing. And if you don't do it, there's consequences.
Yeah. Awesome. So that's the team side of it. Okay. So I think we've got some, you know, it's very clear that from a coaching perspective and from a comms perspective, there's that clarity and honesty with the communication when things start to go wrong. That is so important. And there's that honesty and integrity, I think, from a leadership point of view, or as a coach or any point of view, where it just becomes easy to get things done quickly. And I think that's a really important lesson for the team communication part. Then I think there's two other elements there, which are having clear boundaries and expectations and setting them, and also understanding that the individual is really important within the team. The more an individual feels that they have a role, they have an identity, and we're defining things by common metrics like effort rather than whether you scored, then we can all get on the same page. So I want to just turn into the individual, if I may, and try and look a little bit around, you know, what the resilience, we're trying to engender resilience and well-being. We're trying to look at what, from an individual perspective, it really takes. And I think in your example, what's always struck me about Kajaki and the situation there is the length and the mentality of, it's not necessarily a dynamic situation. You know, you said you've got a lot of things, but above all, things just kept going wrong, didn't they? It went, you know, when we started with Stu Hale, we were within parameters that were manageable, and it gradually ticked off and off and off. So can you take us inside your head a little bit, and when the pressure's on and when that situation kept unfolding like that, you know, how would you talk about the resilience that you had? How did you, I mean, you had no choice is one way to put it, but actually, you know, did you feel like giving up? Like what did you?
Yeah, so it was quite bizarre, because you'd get to a stage where you thought we're sorted, and then, you know, something else would go wrong. And, you know, I remember I touched on earlier, you know, crossing the minefield and getting halfway across, and, you know, thinking, you know, tomorrow's my birthday. It's also my son's first birthday, and, you know, look where I am. And it's very, very difficult, because obviously I love my family with everything. But when you're with the guys on the ground, they're your family and they're your responsibility as well. And so at that time, I would say I loved them equal to what I did with my family. And I knew I had to do my best for them, even to the point where I'd sort of resigned to the fact that I was going to die. I'd rather die doing my best for them than just sitting back and doing nothing. And when I was at school, as academically challenged as I was, and how much of a pain in the ass I was, I'm sure if you spoke to my teachers, there was one teacher that stood out for me, and it was a man called Mr. Fear, Frankie Fear, and he was a former Army physical training instructor, and he was also my rugby coach as well. And I'd got a bad habit of, when I used to run the ball into contact, I used to lead with my head to try and push people out of the way. And he pulled me to one side, and he was quite stern, he was quite strict at me. And I remember him saying to me, the only thing you need to fear in life is fear itself. And as a sort of 12, 13-year-old boy, I took that as, I don't need to be scared of running the ball, I'm just going to be scared of Mr. Fear, because that's what I thought he was referring to. And it wasn't until other situations in my military career where I actually realised what he meant, that fear can take control of you. And people talk about the flight and fight and things like that. Where with pressure, with fear, I sort of find a thrive on it. I understand what my limitations are. I understand what I can do, but I will do anything to get to that. And I've used that sort of mantra and that mentality throughout my life. You know, when I took the job over in Kenya, you know, I was going out to be a director of a company with 4,000 staff working for me. Yeah, I was a 14-year-old school leaver with no qualifications. And it was, I know I'm going to struggle. So what I'll do is I'll work hard on everybody around me to make it easier. And that comes from that discipline and that them core values again that come from the military. But as for the thought process, there is very little thought process when you're involved in an incident. And if you look at statistics, how many casualties come, whether it's in the military or in the civilian world, if you see a car accident, people stop, jump out and go and try and help, and then they get hit by an oncoming car or whatever. People's natural reaction to help is phenomenal. And you sort of go blind and you get into myopia and you get sucked into what you see. And there was times where I had to stop that, and there was times I had to think. For example, when I went to pick the rifle up, and it's just about rationality. It's about looking at the bad and trying to find the good, and using that good as your motivator, to be fair. But yeah, there's a fine line between heroism and stupidity. And the Kajaki incident, for example, I'd say would have been on the stupidity side that day. There was not very much heroism. It was more stupidity, to be honest.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think we can all call it both if you're happy with that. It's just fascinating. I think we look a lot at how you manage pressure, and I think you're getting on there so much about what actually does happen to your mind. And when, in that situation, just, I guess the hard thing was bringing yourself into the process, like the thinking part of it. Because I think we all, we can all understand, not to the same extent, that actually when we're really stressed, and you mentioned the fight or flight, the chemicals start pumping and suddenly, things start to change. But I think, we look a lot about self-talk and what you can say to yourself in that situation. Is there any, it seems to me that the training helps you deal with the pressure situations. And I think that's one thing to kind of get your steer on. I think a lot of people would say, look at your situation and say, well, inherently just amazing guys. But how much does the training and what you do kind of prepare you for the pressure and kind of allow you to, does it give you a help in thinking straight, or is it really just you're in that situation and you just learn, you gotta face that?
When I was in, I know it's changed now, the military a lot about resilience and things nowadays, where there wasn't any of that when I was in, unfortunately. I never had any training on how to deal with pressure. I'd had medical training, but I'd never had medical training to that extent either. And a lot of it is off the cuff. Especially as a medic, you sort of become the mum. People are looking at you, and there's times where clinically, you go blank. Well, you just can't figure out what to do. But everyone's looking at you and everyone's focusing on you, and you're literally holding hands and telling guys they're going to be okay. And it's the thought process, the resilience, the pressure-wise, is all relieved by knowing that they'd do the same for you. And that's what makes it, and that's what was great about the military that I joined. The military that I joined and the military now are massively different, I'd say. When I joined, the military recruited from broken homes and council estates, and it was easy because they could thrash you and break you and then build you into this model that they wanted, and it worked. And so everyone who was sort of my era, we all thought and acted the same. Where now we've got a lot of academics in the military, and we've got proper thinking people, which in my opinion will probably weaken it, to be fair. I never asked why when I got told to do something. If I was told to do it by someone superior to me, they were superior, they knew what I needed to do. Where now we've got a lot of people who are a lot clever than what people like myself are, and they'll question it, will say, isn't this an easier way? Well, that's not going to make the army as strong as what it needs to be. There's two sides to every coin, and people can sort of argue it both ways. But yeah, the army's gone very strong on resilience training and sort of mental processes and thoughts and things. The only thought I had were they were my brothers, and would they do the same for me? And the answer was yes. And there was no real sort of alternative, to be honest.
And I think there's a part of me that thinks that's when you have that underpinning the situation, you have in your decision making, you know, I think in a corporate workplace, for example, one of the things that we're worried about with our decision making is how it's going to be judged. How, you know, whereas I guess in your situation, you're sitting there thinking, my teammates have got my back, so actually my decision they're going to buy into my decisions as well, which means I don't have to I'm only having to second guess myself, but not worry about, you know, is it fair to say that, like, there's confidence?
Yeah, but very much, yeah. So I think, again, as the corporate world, it's dog eat dog, and people, you know, when you stand up to give a presentation in the corporate world, people aren't listening to what you're saying, they're listening for your mistakes and how they can use that against you, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Where in the military, if you hold a standard of any professionalism, if you're a medic or if you're a physical trainer, if you say that's what it is, that's what it is. Yeah. And everyone will be behind you, will support you, and, you know, they'll go with that. There's a lot of questions when the first Stu lost his leg about, let's carry him out. All the guys just wanted to carry him out the hill, and I'm saying, no, if we carry him, you know, head first, you know, he's going to go on an angle, he's going to bleed out. If we carry him feet first, he's going to bleed in. And they're like, all right, cool. And there was no sort of clinical argument or debate. I was the medic, I'd said that's what it was. You know, Mark was an infantry commander, so any sort of decisions on the security side of it or whatever, if that's how it was. And that's one of them respect things as well that is missing in the whole corporate world. You know, people are very much out for themselves. I'm not trying to slag off everyone in the corporate world, because there's some phenomenal people, and
it's relative, you know, to what you know, right?
And don't get me wrong, I think ex-servicemen make terrible businessmen as well, because they try and go into a boardroom and dominate, which doesn't work. And you know, I think one of the things ex-military have to learn is, you know, when they leave the military, they lose that seniority or command and control that they've got, and that they need to fit into the civilian world, where a lot of people expect that they're going to walk out at the same rank as when they left the military, and the civilian world needs to fit around them. And it is about adapting and working into your environment. And, you know, I feel quite, because of the things I went through and the adversity I've had through life, it strengthened me. And, you know, I can walk into a boardroom and I can play the academic and I can hold my own, you know, or I can go back up north and sit on a council estate and chew the fat with, you know, some young kids, you know. And I'm quite diverse, and I think there's a lot of that's missing in today's world. You know, people sit in their different categories, whether it's lower class, middle class, or higher class, and, you know, people just don't get about life anymore. You know, they sit in their own little bubbles and in their own little worlds, and it's just very, very difficult for people to. I remember walking through London. It's totally off the subject. It just shows the world as it is. There was about 3 people behind a lady who was walking down the road, and as she was walking, a bunch of keys fell out of her bag. The 2 people in front of me stepped over them. So I picked them up, I scooped them up, and I ran forward and I said, "Excuse me, you've dropped your keys." And she snatched them out of my hand, looked at me in disgust, and just kept on walking. I was like, really? You know? Yeah. And I thought, I wish I'd thrown them across the road, but that's not the type of person I am, you know. And that's something, we live in that world today where not everyone, but most people, it's about them, not about the bigger picture. And I don't want to sound like a hippie and the whole peace and love thing, but, you know, it is missing. It's missing, you know.
I couldn't agree more. And I think in a certain way you kind of see that with, I mean, you know, we want to stay very politically neutral, but I think whether you wear a mask or not is a good example of this. You know, whether it's right or wrong, whatever, the difficulty that some societies are having in just kind of agreeing around, okay, well, we'll do this because it's for the benefit of everybody. And I think your key example is pointing to something that's probably a little bit something we could learn on a little bit in society, especially from.
If you put that into a military context, okay, just to flip it back.
Yeah.
If someone, as in the Prime Minister, someone who's sitting at this level tells everybody else to do something, they would all do it.
Yeah.
In a military context, whether it's right or wrong or whatever.
Yeah.
Right? Where because of how society is today, people just love to rebel and fight the system. And I'm not saying that the system's right or wrong, and I've got views on both sides of the coin there. But if we're instructed to just do it, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it's not really hard, is it?
And it kind of it goes back to that thing about the communication and the decision making again. It's like, actually, in a lot of situations, most of the time, agreement is the most important thing in getting stuff, certainly in team performance, getting things done well. You know, how many times do you go into a corporate boardroom and you discuss an awful lot of things, but you don't really leave that room with everyone going, okay, right, we're going to do that, we're going to do this. But if you take it back to your example of when you're talking about what to do with Stu Hale, you know, if we lift that into any other situation, it might be a halftime team talk. It might be, you know, a business meeting in a project that's going really, really badly. It's everyone says their bit, which I think is important. Is okay. Well, what are the relevant pieces of information, and then decision made. And I think, you know, if you're looking at performance and team performance, there's certainly that element of saying, okay, well, whatever it is, we've got to buy, whether it's our values as a rugby team or whatever, we're just going to say, this is the line in the sand, this is what we're going to do, and moving forward and doing it together is kind of the only important thing. You know, agreement, whether it's right or wrong, sometimes is well, it's like any decision is better than none, if you will. Okay, so I'm going to just finish off with a couple of few quick fire questions. Okay, and we asked a few of these questions to the first leader in our series, a guy called Eric, who's just sailed sort of 1,000 nautical miles by himself up through the Arctic Ocean. And so it'd just be cool to get, like, bring it back to where we are with the mental skills, what we can teach young people, and generally your thoughts around resilience. So, and this be interesting after what you've talked about today. If you could reach back in time, you could step back or talk to yourself as a 15, 16-year-old kid. If, you know, he showed up on your doorstep or at your rugby club, what would you say to him?
Do it all again.
Do it all again.
Do it all again. You can only learn from making mistakes.
Yeah.
Direction, advice is great, but you've got to ride that wave. And sometimes the best teacher is to make a mistake.
Yeah. Awesome. So what does the word resilient mean to you?
Honest. You can't be resilient unless you're honest with yourself.
Amazing. And what is the best piece of advice anyone's ever given you?
The only thing to fear in life is fear itself.
So it might be that. I'm going to tell you, you've given us so much of your time. I'm going to wrap it up.
Thank you.
But I just, you know, it's an amazing story, an amazing situation. And, you know, I think it's in the context of what we want to talk about here. I think, you know, we've set out we've achieved what we set out to do, which is really hear from someone who knows what they're talking about resilience and how that needs to work in different facets of life. So thank you so much for your time, mate.
Thank you for having me.
And you know, I really hope that everything goes well. Might even try and jump up to Hereford, catch a game or two.
Yeah.
I'm just down the road. And yeah, just thank you so much, Doug, and we really hope to be in touch with you soon.
Excellent, thank you.